Hello, the internet, and welcome to the podcast Byzantium and Friends. I am your very busy host, Anthony. Today we're going to talk about classical scholarship, and specifically philology, that is study, research, publication on classical texts, and in our particular case on Greek classical texts, basically any text from Greek antiquity. This is an extraordinary field compared to the fields that study any other body of literature. And it is extraordinarily privileged too, and among the most advanced in the world. So classicists often don't appreciate this, but the fact that their texts have been edited so carefully, often many times, from the manuscripts to produce published editions with critical apparatus and discussion of the manuscripts and variants and all of that, that they have been commented on repeatedly. So they're not only commentaries and studies and lexika, but there's this entire dedicated apparatus of scholarship around them that makes studying them both easy and a joy and accessible to so many people who don't have to travel to manuscript archives or libraries abroad in order to find that one manuscript of the text that, maybe someone else looked at 30 years ago, and where you can't identify many of the words, and there's very little support in terms of dictionaries and encyclopedias and commentaries to help you work through it. Many other fields are in that precise situation, but not classics. Greece has enjoyed a very, very privileged position in the history of philology generally. In fact, it's been a pioneer. So many of the techniques and methodologies and technologies that have evolved for the study of texts often did so in classical studies first and were then disseminated to other fields. Fragments have been collected. Author biographies have been exhaustively studied. Dates, inscriptions, papyri, everything has been collected, often digitized, made accessible and available. It's an extraordinary privileged position to be in. And classicists often take all of that for granted today. In other words, this entire edifice, which is wonderful and complex and a monument of scholarship, is there and it's available and it's ready for them to use. And yeah, they take it for granted. They often don't know where it all comes from, how it was constructed, what are the elements, the primary elements, the material things from which all these materials were assembled. Like, you rarely actually go and see that inscription, that stone that has the text on it, or that book, that manuscript, which is often a specialized collection, and possibly in Europe, which has the text that you may study for decades, but you never actually go and look and feel the manuscript. And you're kind of cut off from that almost. And this is where our topic today comes into the picture. Many classicists like to believe that the society that they study, ancient Greece, down to, the early empire, was something very, very separate from what they know as Byzantium. That Byzantium rests on a different set of values, both as a state and as a civilization with its own literary, religious, values. They often don't pay much attention to it, learn little about it, and sometimes even think of it as the antithesis of what they work on. So there are certain images associated with classical Greece that often attract people to study ancient Greek texts and ancient Greek culture, and those are perceived to be very, very different from those of Byzantium, and you have to be interested in very different sorts of things in order to be drawn to that. Classics is a much larger and much more prestigious and well-funded and well-organized field in comparison to Byzantine studies, and that is sort of evident to anyone who's part of both and sort of feels that gap, as I am. And yet, there's a certain sense, and I think it's a very important one, a primary one in fact, in which classics is essentially a part of Byzantine studies. It just doesn't know it. It's almost an annex to Byzantine study. It's something that emerges from Byzantium. And why do I say this? Well, on a certain obvious level, almost all of the manuscripts that we have of classical authors are Byzantine ones, and in particular late Byzantine ones, sometimes Middle Byzantine. We very, very rarely have ancient access to ancient texts, like from a papyrus or something like that. The classical texts that we have are those that Byzantine writers and readers decided to preserve and comment on. Not just copy, but study and talk about and add value to. And it's not just that. A great deal of the technology that is involved in classical philology is of Byzantine origin. To mention some very obvious things, the codex form, the book, right? So when you pick up a text, a classical text, today, the only part of it that is distinctively modern is that it has been printed, right, in a press, and that the pages are standardized, and that the apparatus criticus is more explicit and systematized. It is a whole discipline that has evolved primarily in modern times. But if you compare it to the way in which books were read and studied in antiquity, you will realize how decisive the Byzantine contribution was here. So the shift from the roll to the codex, the invention of small case letters, the gradual systematization of accents and punctuation, the conversion of commentaries into scholia. That is, instead of having a commentary that was a separate book that drew your attention to passages in the text and had the scholia were put in the margins, almost as kind of footnotes that can be placed on any part of the page. And the collection of texts of authors together, sometimes even prefaced with a biography of the author, as we'll talk about in this episode. Those are Byzantine innovations that were applied to the selection of classical texts that were most meaningful to Byzantine readers and writers, and therefore survived to our time. The contribution is decisive. And in a certain sense, the classical canon is a Byzantine invention, and classical philology as practiced today has a continual history that, yes, goes back to antiquity, but can be accessed most directly starting in its Byzantine phase. My guest today is Filippomaria Pontani, who is a professor at the Ca' Foscari University of Venice. He is an expert on many aspects of Greek and Byzantine philology, but has especially worked on Byzantine classical scholarship. That is, the ways in which Byzantine scholars and philologists engaged with classical texts and wrote commentaries on them and taught them, and so forth. He has done some extraordinary work on this topic, and what really inspired me to invite him onto the podcast, I wanted to do so for a long time, but I finally read a long survey that he wrote of scholarship in the Byzantine Empire, which is a 150-page contribution to a larger volume called A History of Ancient Greek Scholarship, from the beginnings to the end of the Byzantine Age. It is a magisterial survey, not only of who wrote what, when, and how, but of the kind of fundamental modes in which classical texts were interpreted and studied and understood in Byzantine society, including the social role that all of this activity played and how important it is for understanding our own place in the classical tradition and the Byzantine contribution to it, which was significant. Classicists, you're all Byzantinists but don't know it. Okay, we'll get straight to the interview. Thanks also to medievalist.net for reposting these episodes. And here's my conversation with Filippomaria Pontani. Filippomaria, it's a pleasure to meet you and welcome to the podcast.
Hello, good afternoon.
So you've done some amazing work, and I want to sort of briefly explain what it is to the audience. In addition to granular technical work on Byzantine texts and Byzantine classical scholarship, you've also written a really magnificent survey of Byzantine classical scholarship in a volume called A History of Ancient Greek Scholarship. And it's a chapter that's like, it's 150 pages. So it could be a separate book, right? It's called Scholarship in the Byzantine Empire. And now I've dabbled in this before, but like in an amateurish way compared to what you've done. And so it's a really, really magnificent survey. And I want to thank you for it, because I've been trying for years to get my classicist colleagues to understand the importance of this material. And you can keep saying it again and again and again, but there's still this kind of a idea among many classicists, especially I think in the Anglo-American tradition, where they work less with the manuscripts and the scholia and the things like this, that classical texts are just a sort of thing that we have, and there's not a hit.
It's not only in the Anglo-Saxon tradition or Anglo-American tradition, actually. It is also pretty much rooted in the European tradition due to the German influence. So German influence in the 19th century, where despite some notable work, of course, carried out in manuscripts, the idea that the Byzantine world was something, so to speak, inferior was quite widespread. And the Italian tradition, for example, which is now, over the last few decades, reacting to this, has also been shaped by some important personalities who share this view. I mean, Giorgio Pasquali, probably the most important, influential classical philologist of the 20th century in Italy, and certainly one of the most important in Europe, he was also convinced that Byzantium was basically was not much worth studying. I mean, of course, yes, you could look into the provenance of manuscripts, but just for the sake of studying what the manuscripts actually contained, rather than the environment from where they came from and the meaning they had, the historical meaning they could have. So this is a prejudice that is hard to die. And thanks God, I think in recent decades, at least in Europe, it's and particularly in Italy, I would say there are many colleagues working in this field. And but of course, I mean, I must say you were very generous with my chapter. I must say that this is also an attempt to update and to some extent rewrite Nigel Wilson's very important work on scholars of Byzantium, which is always a model, yes, will always remain. It's just that he had this sort of British attitude to keep the footnotes to a minimum, and I just tried to implement some more information, of course, updates, and 30 years have elapsed, and but also give some more precise references where he tended to be more, I mean, he's a science, but sometimes perhaps some more detailed references can be useful for scholars, but also for amateurs.
Yeah, so looking back to questions of interpretation and what we make of this material at the end, but I want to give our readers, audience, ingrained habit, a kind of sense of what it is that we're dealing with. So let's start with some basic questions, and that is, what sorts of things did Byzantine writers or scholars do with ancient texts such that we can place them indeed that we should place them in the long tradition of classical scholarship? This was more than just copying the texts so that we have them, right? In other words, they weren't doing what they were doing in order to make sure that we have classical texts. They were doing things for their own sake. So what were they doing with classical texts, broadly speaking?
They were doing all sorts of things. Basically, I mean, transcribing is not an easy task. I mean, right. Just imagine, I think that one of the most amazing philological tasks of all times has been the transliteration work. If you imagine just simply changing the script from the scriptio continua, from the continuous script, majuscule script, without any signs, without any word division, into the new format of manuscript script between the 8th and 9th century of the current era has been a huge work, which has required a huge amount of expertise on the part of scribes, most of whom are anonymous. But this is I would say, a constant thing throughout the Byzantine millennium, and this is something that I wanted to highlight in this chapter, that we are always often, I mean, modern scholars are always keen on saying, oh, Photius or Eustathius, the big names of Byzantine philology. But in fact, there is a plethora of hardly known or mostly anonymous scribes who have done amazing jobs in interpreting interpreting and solely understanding and giving a new shape to these texts every time they copy it. Of course, this is not true for all manuscripts, but there are lots of manuscripts that are striking in this respect. And so I think this is, even the transcription is an amazing philological work. Then of course come all the other kind of approaches like commentaries, like editions, because they did produce, I mean, Maximus Planudes did produce in the late 13th century, produce what can be regarded at all effects critical editions of Plutarch or of Diophantus or of many prose and poetic authors who we still read today thanks to these editions, not only thanks to his transcriptions, but thanks to his edition, which is a different thing.
Yeah.
So there are all kinds, and commentary, of course. I mean, and commentaries are also a genre that has developed independently in different traditions, of course, throughout the world. But the Byzantines were very, very good at that. Some very important. I mean, the most important, longest commentaries to Homer that are preserved to this day have been written in the 12th century, and it's just that it's a mentality of writing commentaries that could not only explain a text, but also give as much information as possible to often a school audience on the text and on all the background of that text and all the possible links. This is an approach that is, to us, can be obvious to a certain extent, but for them at that time was, even in Latin quarters and Western quarters, was not that obvious at all, and that we do find in Byzantium. And then more of this, of course, many other tools of lexika, for example. I mean, how important there are in Greek some lexika, so refined lexika that we have pains at finding, for example, in Latin tradition. If you imagine, of course, there again, what you were saying before, classical philologists are mostly interested in finding fragments of ancient authors that are somehow concealed in or quoted in these lexica. But the lexica as such are an amazing enterprise, just because, of course, every lexicon, every dictionary grows out of pre-existing dictionaries. This has always been the case. But in Byzantium, you have this sense of a tradition that is every single time reworked, added on, and it's not simply copied or handed on. I mean, there are the etymological lexica blend interest for etymology, interest for the meaning of words, interest for their grammatical aspect, for their grammatical orthography, and some of these lexica are very, very big, are incredibly bulky for our standards, and they convey a huge amount of information that even on the epistemological level is really hard to compare with even with similar productions in other contemporary cultures.
Yes, sometimes when classicists say a later source, they're usually referring to a Byzantine lexicon or sort of just something like this. So you already mentioned things like what a layperson would call a small case script and the transliteration of ancient texts into that in the codex form, right, in a book, often with some diacritical marks, depending, spaces between words occasionally. So what are some other innovations of Byzantine classical scholarship, things that they did, either they were their first to do or did very well that aren't very well known?
Well, for example, one thing that happened, certainly, it's hard to say if they did invent this, but certainly they did it massively, was to produce a format of book, which is very common even nowadays, namely a book that has a text in the middle and on the margins, the columns of comments, of commentaries of various kinds, of notes of various kinds. What are normally known as a scholia, for example. I mean, the format of ancient texts that blend on the same page, sometimes very few lines of text, and surrounded by by notes of different periods and different age, this is something that is extremely important both for them and for us. It is important for them because, of course, it shows their ambition to gather in one and the same place as much information as possible on that text, which means that that text was read and was studied and was. It's clearly there were lots of readers who wanted to know as much as possible in that text. And of course, very important for us also, because in this process, what happens normally, again, in every exegetical enterprise, you tend to gather in the same place bits and pieces of different commentaries, of different notes from different people, and sometimes from different ages. And for example, the rise of marginal scholia is something that is a practice that has led to amazing results. I mean, I can just quote the probably one of the most impressive manuscripts, Greek manuscripts that are preserved. It's preserved about 400 meters from where I'm speaking now, here in Venice. The Venetus A. It's a manuscript of the Iliad, of Homer's Iliad. Which is equipped with, it's a manuscript of the 9th century, late 9th century, which is equipped with a mass of marginal scholia that is, of course, they're really unique in terms of content. They have they carry almost whatever we know about Alexandrian philology, because these scholia, these notes, go back, for the most part, to the tradition of commentaries and notes written in Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE. So it's amazing that such an impressive, bulky, and ambitious book should be produced with the text of Homer and with commentaries that were some 1,200 years old. And they were really read, and they are extremely important for us because it's the only place where we know what the philologists of Alexandria back in the Hellenistic times thought about every single passage of Homer. And the way the layout of this book, it is immensely difficult to figure out how to refer on the same page to every single line the corresponding notes, and how every line has more than one note, and so you have to put this in the margins, in between the margins and the text. It's a chiseling sort of, which must have taken ages to complete, and the final result, again, even beyond the content, even in terms of form, is bordering on perfection. And this is, and we don't know, have no idea who on earth has done this. And this is something amazing. We have no name attached to this enterprise, but that's what I was saying before. It is these anonymous enterprises to which we owe so much, but they were clearly done because there was someone paying for them and someone caring for these texts.
Yeah, so the audience should imagine sometimes the page, so when you were referring to marginal comments and scholia and so on, it's almost like a page that has footnotes, but in all of the margins. So it's kind of something like that. But I encourage the audience to go look up the manuscript of Venetus A, just kind of see some of its pages online, what it looks like. It's a really beautiful production. So to keep things in perspective, can you tell us some things that Byzantine scholars did not do with classical texts that we might associate today with, like it's a fundamental mode of classical scholarship?
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, every discipline has its history, and so clearly we are now deep in the sort of 19th century positivistic mood. Now it's almost old-fashioned nowadays, but we certainly tend to do with texts different things. Critical editions are rest on a basis that is different from what our ancient colleagues and our Byzantine colleagues used to think. Namely, we tend to reconstruct the whole manuscript transmission of a single text, to collate, to compare all existing manuscripts, to try and establish the relationship between, the mutual relationship between all existing manuscripts, where possible to draw a stemma and a critical apparatus. But I mean, this is something that we have been doing over the last 200 years, and it is a technique that would be unthinkable without, not only without the material that has been handed over by the Byzantines, namely the texts themselves, but also without the expertise, because you were talking about this prejudice. I mean, this prejudice against the Byzantines has its roots, of course, in the Renaissance, in the West, because it's then that things changed. But if you look at the Renaissance, when the Byzantines already had this sort of bad renown of being sort of half literate, they didn't really speak Latin at all, and they I mean, it's not only that they brought to the West in the 15th century, after the fall of Constantinople, the texts in forms of codices, but they also brought with them this expertise of what to do with Greek texts, from which the Western scholars had a huge amount to learn. And the praxis of collating manuscripts, of restoring manuscripts, of what we call philological work is something that the Western scholars have to a great extent also learned from their Byzantine colleagues who came over to Italy after the fall, or shortly after the fall of Constantinople. So it's also a matter of techniques. Of course, now we do different things because after a long time we have refined our methods. This is clear. But again, it is not a matter of a radical departure from early methods. It's a matter of innovation on an ongoing tradition.
Yeah, and collating manuscripts in order to produce a stemma requires that you have some kind of basic inventory or database of the manuscripts of a particular text. And to my knowledge, there was no such thing in Byzantium. Like, it was all probably just oral information, like, oh, you happen to hear that there's this text over there, and you might get 2 or 3 at most. But yeah. I don't think they ever had a comprehensive view.
No, certainly not. I mean, again, as I said, the collation of the whole range of existing manuscripts. But this is a very recent thing, even for Westerners. I mean, in the 17th century, no one would come to the idea of collating all existing manuscripts. It's also only at the end of the 18th, early 19th that this rule imposed itself. No, what we do find, however, is that there is a sensibility for manuscripts that is often overlooked in Byzantium, for collating manuscripts, for collating copies. Again, due to the aforementioned prejudice, we tend to obliterate the fact that, for example, it's not only a matter of classical texts. If you look at the Acts of Councils, you see how many times, even back in the 7th century, the Dark Ages, you find people going to the library. It's written that they went to the library and fetched this book and checked the passage on the book, and just in order to establish whether that specific phrase of John Chrysostom or the Gospel, for that matter, was written in a proper way or not. So the idea that texts evolve and have mistakes, and you have always to look after them, is well rooted in Byzantine society. And so it's nothing strange when Planudes, at a certain time in the 13th century, comes up with a Plutarch manuscript and has this wonderful note. At a certain point, he says, he writes in a note that this passage is very obscure because the text of the old copies, worn away in many places, does not yield a continuous and consistent sense. I have seen an old book with many blank spaces left by the scribe who was unable to find the missing words, but hoped perhaps to find them elsewhere. Here, on the other hand, in place of what was missing, one finds continuous writing because there was no hope of finding the missing parts. I mean, this is a philological note, which is more or less a sort of paraphrasis of what you would find in a critical apparatus of modern editions. This is written in 1295, probably.
Yeah, what struck me in reading the Acts of the Ecumenical Councils, I've been working on those at the same time as writing this history of Byzantium that I'm working on, is that many of them were less theological than philological. And the theological arguments often came down to philological arguments about, is this word authentic in this text? What does your copy say? No, my copy has this. And it's incredible to watch the bishops essentially do philology and, critical, engage critically with the text in the council. Like they're having these long philological speeches. Anyway,
No, but that's not an obvious thing. I mean, just think of this just for comparison. Just think of this in Arabic quarters or even in Jewish quarters. This is very difficult to find something of this kind. Of course, they have their different traditions, but it's for holy texts or texts pertaining to religion. It's much more difficult to find this philological sensibility. Whereas this is in Byzantine culture, this is pervasive. So it is certainly a theocratic world, whatever you like, but there is a sensitivity for the philological detail of even of the gospel. I mean, just think of the anonymous professor. It's this guy who don't know who he is in the 10th century, looking for or being asked to produce editions of again theological works or the gospel. So it's an idea that we are as classicists or specialists in classical and pagan literature, we only tend to focus on our texts. But if you get the bigger picture, you understand that this phenomenon is by no means limited to Hesiod or Homer or Euripides. It is something that is very much present in the Byzantine consciousness, even for the texts they cared more for, which of course are the ecclesiastical and religious texts of various kinds.
Yeah, so I want the audience to come away also with some very specific examples to carry away sort of in their mind. You mentioned the Venetus Alpha of Homer, so that's great. What's your favorite Byzantine lexicon or encyclopedia and why?
Mm-hmm. Well, I have two. I'll be very brief, but I just, I mean, one of course is a Suda, because a Suda is just such an amazing enterprise. It's an encyclopedia, by all means, a 10th century product that was clearly, to my mind, linked with the Byzantine court, with the imperial patronage, which has had such an important role in that century in the transmission of culture. And there is this encyclopedic thrust where especially Constantine VII, but also other emperors of that age, they tended to produce anthologies, excerpts, and again, this encyclopedia, which is extremely important for everyone, because even for every classical scholar, because it is the first place where you get biographies of ancient authors, for that matter. We don't have any other bibliographical data on Euripides or on Aristarchus. It's the first place where you get them. So you always have to start, and you can then critique or even deconstruct completely the information you get there. But it's an incredible source of knowledge. But I would say that it's interesting. Suda is interesting because it has this it has lots of meanings and so lexicographical entries, but also purely encyclopedic data like again entries like Jesus or again Homer or whatever. And this is an incredibly ambitious project. But I would like to just to mention briefly the one lexicon which is not particularly popular. It's the Etymologicum Gudianum. It is an etymological lexicon of the 10th century, 10th or early 11th century, which is not particularly interesting per se. It's one of those texts, lexica I was mentioning earlier. What I would like to stress is that we have the very manuscript where this was produced, on which the final, more or less final version of this etymological was produced. And it's touching to see how this lexicon actually came about. I mean, you have this manuscript in the Vatican Library where you see exactly the procedure I was hinting at before. You see this a basic stratum of a basic layer of an earlier lexicon, and then additions on all cropping up here and there on the page, where on every blank hole is then filled with small entries and additions and addenda. and then, of course, in later copies, this is all made tidy and tidied up, and it has a normal transmission as a serious lexicon. But when you see where it comes from, and probably there is a chance this very complicated operation, you might imagine a man or a guy working with several books at the same time on his desk and trying to squeeze them into one. And this might have taken place in southern Italy. This is very debated whether this is or not, but the idea, they're all, I mean, the hints paleographically, the paleographical analysis brings us to southern Italy rather than to Constantinople. This is debated between scholars because there is no certainty about that. But if it were true, it would be all the more interesting to see how even not only in the capital, not only in Constantinople, but even in other regions of the Byzantine Empire, there was this interest for not only transmitting knowledge, but also producing new knowledge and sort of trying to foster erudition even in smaller centers and smaller schools and far from the capital.
Yes, nice. And those are etymologica that the wrong search in the TLG will lead you deep into that world of the etymologica and all the dictionaries. Okay, so what's your favorite Byzantine commentary on a classical author and why?
Well, if I may quote a very an unpublished commentary, so that's to do something original. Yes. The commentary by Issac Sebastocrator or Isaac Porphyrogenitus to the Iliad is still unpublished. It still lies unpublished in a manuscript in Paris. It is, as far as we know, the earliest commentary written on the Iliad, full-fledged commentary written on the Iliad in Byzantium. It was written in the 12th century, in the early 12th century. It is not particularly inspiring for classical scholars, but it is very interesting for cultural reasons. Because first of all, because the author is not is a very well known person. Is the son of an emperor and the brother of Anna Komnene, so a person who had a very high standing in the Komnenian dynasty in the 12th century in Constantinople, and a very complicated life. And so you ask, this is one of the basic questions, when did these people who are bishops, archbishops, politicians, generals, when did they find time to do it? Anyway, he writes this full-fledged commentary to the Iliad, which is not only a commentary, it is a sort of really a sort of general edition of the poem. It has an introduction with the so-called Petermissa ab Homero, the missing things, the things that Homer doesn't say, and so basically the artifacts of the Iliad and what you need to know in order to get into the poem. And then it has also at the end a sort of appendix with the physiognomical traits of the various heroes, which can always be useful. Homer does not dwell much on this, but of course the Byzantines were keen on trying to draw from the fact that Achilles is blonde what his character might look like, and so this means that he has a broader interest also in not only doing fine erudite work, refined erudite work on the poem, but also on transmitting it to his own age. And then what he does in the marginal notes, marginal scholia that we have, is that he really interacts a lot in a sometimes very direct way with the text. And when, for example, Hera deceives Zeus at a certain point there is a famous deception of Zeus in the 14th book of the Iliad, he has long notes, very misogynist note against the power of women, especially through sex and so on. And it clearly shows that he's taking the text seriously, very much seriously. And there are notes that are surprising. I would just like to mention one category of notes that are completely at odds with all we know of the Greek tradition on the Iliad. namely Hector. The character of Hector is always considered as the villain in Greek exegesis, in Greek commentaries ever since. They tend to say that, yes, well, he's certainly a valiant warrior, but he makes mistakes all the time. He has no strategy whatsoever, and at the end he runs away in front of Achilles out of fear, so he's not that valiant either, and so on. So there's a long tradition of really of considering Hector in a terrible way. Whereas he is probably the only person who systematically, the numbers I know of at least, who systematically shows how good Homer Hector is, how he shows his total, not only sympathy, but his enthusiasm with Hector, with the figure of Hector. This is something that is still unexplained to my mind. It has means, again, that he's not simply handing over a tradition, because of course he knows earlier commentaries and he sometimes shapes his own notes on older notes, sometimes century-old notes, but he also adds new things that correspond to his taste or to his way of interacting with the text. And this is a very fresh approach to the text, and something not always, for example, Eustathius is less fresh than he is, let's say.
Yeah, that's pretty fascinating, because modern scholarship tends to look kindly on Hector as a kind of family man who gets caught up in all of this murderous war. And,
yes.
And
that's very modern, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm fascinated that you would choose Isaac's work to highlight this way, because I only just recently put the pieces together about who he was, and specifically his funeral arrangements and the whole contest that was going on within the Komneni about who gets to control the legacy of Alexius, because neither he nor his sister Anna became the rulers. It was their brother, right, John II Komnenos, and both of them are trying to find these other ways to position themselves. Anyway, it's a
as you very well know, that he had lots of contacts with the Turks as well, and this is something that might, to a certain extent, explain because, as you very well know, there's the old habit of identifying the Greeks, the Trojans with the enemies, and I don't know if those sympathies might, because it's very likely that he has written this in his last years. That's what we tend to think, because he retired in a monastery very close to the modern present-day border in Thrace, between Greece and Turkey, the monastery of Vera, and there it is possible, to my mind, that this manuscript is actually the copy of his own manuscript preserved in Vera, and it might be that I have this hunch that he, looking back into his life and his adventures and so on, he had a different take also on the characters of the Iliad, which means really appropriating the ancient poem. It's not an obvious thing. It's not an act of mere erudition.
Yeah. So now that we're talking about the personalities of these people, I was just wondering, this is an odd question, but I was wondering if there was any Byzantine classical scholar whom you would either really like to have as a colleague, say, in a department, or whom you would really not want to have as a colleague, just based on, how you might imagine their personality from their work and their writings.
Well, there's one single scholar. The obvious answer to your question is a colleague you would both love and hate at the same time is John Tzitzis. You would love him for his immense, incredible erudition. I mean, he's amazing because the range of things that he is the only one, apparently at least the only one, to know, not only in the 12th century but in the whole of the Byzantine millennium, is really startling. So the memory that he has is incredible. But the thing that is most significant with Tzitzis is that he does not belong. He's really the odd person in that. The odd item. He does not belong to any of the categories that are typically associated with Byzantine scholarship. He seems to be a sort of freelance, and he has no affiliation to the ecclesiastical hierarchy, no affiliation to the court, although the court, he tries to get patronage, and he succeeds for a while, but then again he fails, and he has the interesting thing is that he tells about his life in relationship with his studies in a way that is also very modern. I mean, the literatum infelicitas, it's a topos that we tend to associate with modern times. But the way he's really a scholar who lived through difficult times. He has starved sometimes. He has had very serious money problems, and but then at the same time he finds good patrons and has the time and leisure to write, to study. And then when he does, what he produces, commentaries on Aristophanes, commentaries on Homer, commentaries on Lycophron, on all sorts of authors. Those are masterpieces. I mean, you really wonder where he had all these books, because this is not an obvious question. Because if you had the patriarchal library at your disposal, it's good. But if you could not rely on institutions, you really wonder how, it's full of admiration, how he could possibly know so much about ancient sources, to the point of being the only one who was reading at least the first book of the ancient lyric Hipponax. The Hipponax is a guy who wrote in the 8th century, in the 7th century, BCE, and of whom we do not have anything but some fragments today. And it is absolutely clear from what Theseus writes that he was probably the last person, I don't know, but to own and to read few poems of him, which is entire poems of him, which is also. It's also interesting because it's a kind of personality. Both Hipponax and Theseus are sort of very difficult personalities.
Oh, yes.
You have to complain with everything, and they're not very satisfied with their life. And basically also to have this rivalry. Also very interesting, the rivalries with his predecessors in scholarship and with his colleagues. I mean, Theseus is all the time complaining that he's surrounded by a mass of ignorant colleagues and so on. That's why in a department it would be difficult to have him. But on the other hand, you would certainly profit from his scholarship and from his learning.
Yes, I would imagine him as taking easily to Twitter in order to abuse his colleagues. No, he could condense so many insults into, I don't know, 100 characters.
100 characters, yes. Probably with just 1 or 2 words. He was also fond of this maximum, very long words full of insults. It was clearly
yes. I can imagine him as keeping human resources very busy. Okay, so a big question now, sort of zooming out, why did the Byzantines study these classical texts and produce all of this scholarship? It is a labor-intensive and can be very expensive project and activity. So what benefits did they collectively think they were getting from it? I mean, as a society, generally, obviously not everybody's investing in this sort of thing, but enough institutions and wealthy people did. Why did they do that? Why did they keep all this stuff? Why did they keep talking about classical texts?
Well, this is a very complicated question. As you know, you've written books on this, so it's. I would just to keep things to a minimum. I would say this: the Byzantine culture gave a huge importance to speaking, to rhetoric, to the ways in which you persuade other people and the ways in which you speak in a persuasive way in front of others. This was particularly true and was actually one of the main instruments of power for the ruling elite, both in terms of ecclesiastical elite and in terms of secular elite. Both emperors and patriarchs and archbishops had to be able to speak well and to write well in order to preserve their power, basically. So if this is the principle, at that point you have, the tools you have to handle for this goal are necessarily the best works, the best language, the best style you can possibly get hold of. And all of this, the best style, the best language, and the best works, the Byzantine culture, despite the fact it was a deeply Christian culture, still believed that to identify with the classical heritage, at least with part of the classical heritage. And this is, of course, something that has to do perhaps less with what we now look for in these texts, in Greek texts, ancient Greek texts, but is still a very important part of these texts. So once you read Plato or Demosthenes or Aristophanes, in order to know how you can write proper Attic, and how you can impress other people with a refined style and good oratory, you are in a way also making some characters and features of those texts, of those ancient texts, to emerge. And this is why there are approaches, scholarly approaches to these texts in terms of, again, lexicography, rhetoric, rhetorical studies, grammatical handbooks that are immensely influential and important, were influential for even nowadays. I mean, they're still important in order to get us to grasp the workings of these, of ancient style and of ancient language. So it is not, there is a tendency to say, well, they were just looking at the form, they didn't care for the content. This is really a very, very artificial division. And I find that it is true that, of course, this entails the, not the censorship, not the elimination, but the neglect of some authors. This happens, it happened in antiquity just as much as it happened in Byzantine times, because in the 3rd century, already there were already texts that were no longer read. In 3rd century Rome, Ennius was barely read. So it's just that this kind of neglect is inevitable as time goes by. It is true that focusing on a specific curriculum that was particularly suitable for those goals, for rhetorical, stylistic, grammatical goals, clearly limited in a way the range of texts were, but still the amount of texts that were nonetheless transmitted was really remarkable. And so in this way, I think this was an enterprise that was always backed by institutions, as opposed to what happened in the West. And this is a basic difference from the Latin tradition, where you have monasteries or isolated initiatives, whereas if you have with different intensity over time, but you have the empire, the imperial school, or the patriarchal academy, and the bishoprics and so on, that who clearly are institutionally caring for the survival of these texts, then of course these texts are secured a much easier life.
Yeah, I was wondering if I could add something to that and or run it by you, and you tell me what you think, because I have the impression, I've always had it, that there's a misalignment between the way we approach classical texts and the kind of interest that we have in them, and the way in which Byzantine scholars engage with them, which is that their emphasis was far more on the pleasure of the style. Right, like burrowing into the language of an author and appreciating the particularities of that author's style was an inherent pleasure in doing that. And you can see that in Photius's right, his reviews of all the ancient books. He's trying to classify their style, and because their intuitive appreciation of Greek was like superior to ours, I'm not sure that there are many scholars today who can appreciate stylistics, right, on that level, and we kind of miss that aspect, and it would almost be akin to like appreciating music or art, right? Like it was something of that involved, because they keep talking about the pleasure that they get from the logoi, right, and reading, right? Is that, well, how would you respond to that? I mean, that's just a personal thing of mine.
Well, it goes exactly in the same line I was trying to highlight before. It's just that, again, Planudes, I will quote a sentence of Planudes, we should note that the reading of Hellenic literature has always been an object of longing and delight for lovers of learning, and particularly of the poem of Homer, because of the grace and variety of the language. This is, I mean, but this is something that is, it is not sort of extrapolated or interpolated from the outside. It's something that is the qualities that are. I mean, the essays on style by Psellus, by Michael Psellus, for example, on the style of Euripides or of the Byzantine novelists. They show an awareness of the workings of Greek language and Greek style, both in prose and in poetry, that is really hard to gain even for us modern scholars who basically speak a different language. And it's this should not be, again, sort of thought of as a marginal interest of only servile interest, subservient to other. It's something that has to do with the very literary quality of the text we are dealing with. Of course, then the message that they carried, some of them carried, was perhaps less successful in Byzantine quarters. I may say that Lysistrata was probably not taken at face value for the message it could convey. Sure. But still, style and the pleasure of style and the ability also of getting, as you were saying, into the workings. So that's why also Planudes also writes a grammar, and so many people write a grammar or a syntax or engage in writing lexica, like Phocius himself, for example. Yeah. They are clearly reading these texts in order to understand better the way you should write and way you should speak in a pleasant and persuasive way.
Yeah, and I read the rhetorical commentaries and manuals in that way as a sort of attempt to try to capture the style of an author beyond the actual grammar. And that is perhaps something that we can do in our native languages, for example. Like if you take Gibbon and Hemingway, who are both English, right? But anyone experienced in reading English literature will be able to say, oh, this style is more, does these kinds of things, and it's completely different register from the other one. But it's so difficult for us to do that with not just ancient Greek, but Byzantine Greek as well, like because they aimed to replicate those stylistic modes, and I just find that very difficult. And we haven't, I think, as a field, made tremendous advances in that direction. I mean, there are very few people who can do it. Anyway, so I want to move on to another topic because we're almost running out of time. But this is also very important, and you just mentioned it now, that this is a Christian society, and yet most of the texts that they're studying are written in antiquity. If they're not overtly pagan, they nevertheless come from a pre-Christian social context. Now, obviously, the Byzantine scholars who choose to invest a lot of time and work on these texts are not going to be too troubled by that. But surely it came up in their work in some way. So where do you see some sort of striking examples of Byzantine scholars who are kind of working around the gods or the paganism in their material? How do they cope with that?
Well, there are different strategies to do this, of course, also depending on what kind of text you're dealing with. I mean, Plato was a particularly difficult text, not only for its paganism, but for its philosophy, basically. And this is a different issue. I mean, Plato has always been a problem
for everybody.
For everybody, exactly. If you are talking about mythology, which is perhaps the easiest, the most evident problem, I mean, polytheism and the story about the gods. Well, I think allegory certainly plays an important role, and you do have a whole strand of Byzantine allegorists who are very in the tradition. There are lots of histories of allegory where the Byzantine cote has a very, very minor place. But in fact, there are ways of, first of all, of telling the story of Homer. That's what Manuel Gabelas, for example, does in the early 14th century, the story of Homer without making any reference to the gods, and thus rationalizing whatever it is. I mean, if you find Athena, you simply think that, you simply say that the reason, the mind of this or that character has done this or that. So it's a way of rationalizing the gods and their interventions. This is, or else you really build allegorical interpretations, be they physical or psychological or whatever interpretations on the gods. The gods mean something else. This is a strategy that was as old as Greek culture itself. It was again nothing new. It could be used when it came to difficult moments, and it could be used. Although I must say that the most serious scholars they resort to it only in cases of emergency. They don't use it systematically. I mean, Eustathius or Tzetzes, they have no special sympathy for allegory. They do use it sometimes, but I mean, yeah, of course, when there is something, the loves of Ares and Aphrodite, of course, then at that point, there are very difficult, but those were the very difficult passages that were difficult even for Plato, for ancient authors as well, because the problems we have, Christian society has with the gods, are not that dissimilar to problems that also ancient societies had with stories about the gods, which are always full of very strange sexual adventures or very improper behaviors of these or that characters. So it's I think that certainly there was no programmatic hostility, save of course some rare cases, and no censorship for that matter, which is also striking to a certain extent. No, it's you could expect this to happen, but it does not happen, and there are strategies that to just not to highlight the most disturbing elements, but I think that it's again the stylistic and rhetorical and gain that there is to be drawn from reading these texts is far superior to any possible danger they could infer. There are, like in the West, some scholars who sometimes hesitate. Am I becoming like Matthew of Ephesus? Manuel Gabalas, he writes in a letter, am I appreciating Homer too much? Am I becoming too like Petrarch? You know? But it's very rare. It happens rarely, and certainly because the debate was settled very early on with St. Basil, was settled very early on with the church fathers in the Greek East, and had much less. It settled the cultural frame for a judicious and wise use of the ancient material, in a much stronger and more solid way than in the West. So in the end, it was not such a huge problem as we could expect.
Yeah, no, you're quite right, especially about the censorship. And perhaps we haven't even thought about that as much as we should, that it didn't really happen. And as you were speaking, I was struck because I remember the example of the late philosopher Platon in the 15th century, who in some respects had broken with Christianity and who was a kind of like a Neoplatonist in his philosophy. He actually did censor passages of Herodotus that he found were sort of inappropriate given his Platonic conception of the gods, because Herodotus is saying some pretty pre-Platonic things. I think it's Fabio Pagani has written about how Platon is sort of striking out lines of Herodotus and rewriting them to make them more, and that's not by an Orthodox scholar.
No. Well, he paid for this. He ran into serious trouble himself.
So, not for his readings of Herodotus, but
when you start doing this, then you often fall the victim of your own methods. So.
That's great. Any final thoughts? Because we're almost out of time. Where does the discipline go from here, or any last thoughts you would like to convey to the audience?
Well, I think that it should be. Studying these manuscripts, studying these scholars, Byzantine scholars, should make us realize how much we are indebted to them and how much we are. There is again this continuity. I will mention just one manuscript because it's nice to end on it, which is again preserved 200 meters from here in the Marciana Library. It is a manuscript carrying the first Latin translation of the Odyssey. The first after centuries. I mean, the Latin Middle Ages did not know at all the text of Homer, and at a certain time in the 1360s, it was translated back into Latin for the first time from the Greek. And this was the initiative of a Greek a Greek person, Leoncio Pilato, a very strange guy, formerly thought to come from southern Italy, he probably came from Greece proper. Anyway, he worked in southern Italy. He then was hired by Francesco Petrarca and Giovanni Boccaccio, so the founding fathers of Western humanism in Florence in the 1360s. And we have a manuscript where you have a Byzantine scholar, because Leontios Pilatos is a Byzantine scholar, copying out the text, adding notes that clearly come scholia, marginal scholia, that clearly derive from a century-old tradition that can be traced back to the Hellenistic times. And then in between the lines, writing a Latin, very, very bad, awful, but word for word Latin translation of the Greek, which is anyway much better than nothing. And so and performing that's a task from which both Petrarch and Boccaccio, who left their own notes on that manuscript, as I discovered Petrarch's hand and a colleague of mine discovered Boccaccio's hand. So on this very manuscript, you get a sense of what it means, a tradition that is uninterrupted between Byzantium and the Italian humanism, Italian Renaissance, and so the Western world. And this kind of exchange is visible in that manuscript, but is less visible, but took place all the same in hundreds of other cases. And it's basically to this exchange that we owe what we are today.
That's a wonderful place on which to end this. Filippomaria, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. Also for writing the survey. I dove into it like it was a jar of cookies. And I'll reference it in the episode description, so hopefully others will go read it. Thank you so much again.
Thanks to you, Anthony. It was a pleasure. Thank you.